February 23, 1945. Manila, Luzon, Philippines. Lieutenant Colonel James R.N. Weaver stood beside the intact Type 97 Chiha medium tank, his hand resting against armor plating that felt disturbingly thin beneath his palm. The tank had been abandoned by its crew during the American recapture of the city, left behind as Japanese forces retreated northward into the mountains. Technical Air Intelligence Unit personnel had already photographed and documented the vehicle from every angle. Now Weaver, commanding officer of the Army's Ground Forces Equipment Technical Intelligence Unit, had come to conduct the detailed examination that would reshape American understanding of Japanese armored doctrine. The tank sat in what remained of the Pandacan district, its dark green paint barely visible beneath layers of dust and soot. It measured 4.38 meters from bow to stern, 2.33 meters wide at the tracks, 2.23 meters tall to the top of the commander's cupola. In American measurements, that translated to 14 feet 4 inches long, 7 feet 8 inches wide, just over 7 feet tall. A man of average height could look directly into the turret if he stood beside the vehicle. The armor appeared intact, showing no signs of combat damage that had forced its abandonment. The crew had simply walked away, recognizing perhaps that remaining with the tank offered less chance of survival than fleeing on foot. What drew Weaver's attention, what would transform American tactical assessment of Japanese armor capabilities, was the armor itself. He had brought a simple measuring tool, a micrometer capable of precise thickness readings. The measurements he recorded that afternoon would be transmitted to every Marine and Army unit in the Pacific within weeks. The glacis plate, the frontal armor angled to deflect incoming fire, measured 25 millimeters at its thickest point. The turret front, designed to protect the crew during direct engagement, measured 25 millimeters. The side armor, vulnerable to flanking fire from any angle, measured 25 millimeters on the upper hull and 20 millimeters on the lower sections. The rear armor, exposed to attack from behind, measured 20 millimeters. The turret sides measured 25 millimeters. The roof and belly armor measured 12 millimeters. Weaver had examined German Panzer III and IV tanks captured in North Africa. He had studied reports on Soviet T-34 armor from intelligence shared by Allied sources. He understood armor metallurgy, penetration mechanics, and the mathematics of protection versus weight. The Chiha's armor specifications defied everything he knew about medium tank design philosophy. This was not a light tank, classified as a medium tank by Japanese doctrine, carrying a 57mm main gun and weighing 15 tons fully loaded. Yet its armor protection was barely superior to American light tanks, inferior to the M3 Stuart, which mounted 38mm of frontal armor despite weighing less. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The implications were immediate and tactical. American forces had been treating Japanese medium tanks with caution appropriate to vehicles in that classification. Tank commanders had been briefed to engage Chihas with main gunfire, to maintain distance, to respect the threat represented by enemy armor. But the measurements Weaver recorded told a different story. 25 millimeters of steel, even face-hardened steel angled for maximum effectiveness, could be defeated by weapons far less powerful than the 75mm guns mounted on Sherman tanks. The 37mm anti-tank guns that American infantry units carried as standard equipment could penetrate 25mm of armor at ranges exceeding 500 meters. The 2.36-inch bazooka rocket launchers that individual soldiers could carry and operate could penetrate 25mm from any angle. Even the 50-caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun, firing armor-piercing ammunition at close range, had sufficient energy to defeat 25mm of face-hardened steel. Weaver climbed through the driver's hatch to examine the interior. The fighting compartment was cramped but better organized than the Type 95 Hargo light tank he had examined months earlier. 4 men crewed the Chiha. The driver sat in the front left of the hull with a simple periscope providing forward vision. The bow machine gunner occupied the front right position, operating a Type 97 7.7mm machine gun mounted in a ball mount that offered limited traverse. The turret housed 2 men. The commander stood in the left rear position, with responsibility for directing the tank, maintaining awareness of the tactical situation, and coordinating with other vehicles when radio equipment was available. The gunner occupied the right side of the turret, operating the Type 97 57mm main gun. The division of labour represented an improvement over the Hargo, where a single commander performed all turret functions. But the internal arrangements still reflected compromises, driven by weight constraints. There were no seats in the turret. Both commander and gunner stood throughout combat operations, their feet resting on the hull floor with no turret basket beneath them. The turret rotated by hand crank, requiring physical effort from whoever operated it. Ammunition storage consisted of racks holding up to 120 rounds of 57mm ammunition, organized but not protected by additional armor or separated from the crew by blast-resistant barriers. If an enemy round penetrated the fighting compartment and struck stored ammunition, the resulting explosion would kill everyone inside. The engine compartment housed a Mitsubishi Type 97 12-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine, producing 170 horsepower at 2,000 revolutions per minute. The diesel fuel system made the tank less vulnerable to fires than gasoline-powered vehicles, a lesson Japanese designers had learned from earlier combat experience. The engine could propel the 15-ton tank to speeds approaching 40 km per hour on paved roads, 20 to 25 km per hour cross-country. Maximum range on internal fuel of approximately 110 litres was roughly 210 kilometres on roads, less than half that distance in difficult terrain. The specifications painted a picture of engineering optimization within severe constraints. The Chiha designers had created a tank that maximized firepower and mobility while accepting minimal armor protection as the price for achieving acceptable performance within weight limits. The 57mm gun could engage enemy infantry positions, destroy fortifications, and theoretically combat other tanks. The diesel engine provided range and reduced fire risk. The suspension system allowed reasonable cross-country mobility. But the armor, the fundamental protective element that defined a tank's survivability, was inadequate for sustained combat against any opponent with modern anti-tank weapons. American forces had first encountered Chiha tanks in December 1941 during the Philippines campaign. On December 22nd, Japanese armor had engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks north of Damortis in what would be recorded as the first tank versus tank battle involving United States forces in the Pacific Theater. The engagement had been confused and inconclusive, fought at close range in terrain that limited maneuver. Both sides had claimed victories. Both sides had lost vehicles. American commanders, lacking detailed intelligence on Japanese tank capabilities, had treated the Chiha as a legitimate threat, requiring respect and proper tactical response. This assessment had persisted through subsequent campaigns. At Tarawa in November 1943, destroyed Japanese tanks had been examined but not systematically analyzed. At Kwajalein in February 1944, similar cursory inspections had occurred. The first detailed technical intelligence examination of an intact Chiha had taken place in June 1944 on Saipan, where Marine Technical Intelligence units had measured armor thickness and documented internal arrangements. But those findings had not been widely distributed, buried in intelligence reports that circulated primarily among specialized units rather than operational commanders. Weaver's examination in Manila would be different. The findings would be compiled into a comprehensive technical intelligence bulletin distributed to every major unit in the Pacific. Tank commanders would receive specific guidance on engaging Chihas. Infantry officers would learn that their organic anti-tank weapons were effective against Japanese medium tanks. The psychological advantage Japanese armor had enjoyed through American uncertainty would evaporate, replaced by confident understanding based on measured fact. The journey to this moment had begun 13 years earlier, in October 1932, when the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff issued requirements for a new medium tank. The Type 89 medium tank, then in service, had proven adequate for operations in Manchuria, but showed limitations in speed and firepower. Army planners envisioned future operations requiring faster, more mobile armor capable of supporting mechanized infantry and conducting independent operations across extended distances. The specifications reflected these operational requirements. The new tank would weigh approximately 15 tons, mount a main gun of at least 50 mm caliber, achieve speeds exceeding 30 km per hour, and incorporate improvements in armor protection compared to existing designs. The Technical Bureau of the Army Ordnance Department assigned development to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the same company that had designed the Type 89. Chief Engineer Tomio Hara led the design team. Hara had worked on virtually every Japanese tank project since the mid-1920s, accumulating expertise in armored vehicle design that few Japanese engineers could match. He understood the constraints within which Japanese tank designers operated. Japan's industrial base, while growing, remained limited compared to Western nations. Steel production was constrained by limited domestic iron ore supplies and dependence on imported raw materials. Manufacturing capacity was concentrated in relatively few facilities. Design philosophy emphasized simplicity of production and maintenance over sophisticated engineering solutions that might be difficult to manufacture or support in field conditions. Hara's team began with the suspension system. They studied foreign designs, analyzing intelligence reports on Soviet, German, British, and American tanks. The solution they developed was a modified version of the bell crank suspension system used on the Type 95 Hargo light tank. The Chiha would use 6 road wheels per side, grouped in 3 bogie pairs, each pair connected to a bell crank arm that provided vertical movement through compression springs. The system was mechanically simple, relatively easy to manufacture, and had proven reliable in service. It provided adequate shock absorption for cross-country movement, while maintaining acceptable ground pressure distribution. The hull design emphasized simplicity. Armor plates were flat or simply angled, avoiding complex curves that would require sophisticated forming equipment. The glacis plate angled at approximately 15 degrees from vertical, providing some deflection capability without requiring elaborate fabrication. Plates were riveted together in most areas, with welding used only where stress concentrations required stronger joints. The riveted construction simplified manufacturing and allowed field repairs using equipment available at forward maintenance facilities. The turret mounted the Type 97 57mm gun as main armament. This weapon represented a significant upgrade from the 37mm guns mounted on earlier Japanese tanks. The 57mm gun could fire high-explosive rounds effective against infantry and fortifications, and armor-piercing rounds theoretically capable of engaging enemy tanks. Muzzle velocity with armor-piercing ammunition reached approximately 680 meters per second, providing penetration capability against armor up to approximately 45 millimeters thick at ranges of 500 meters under ideal impact angles. The armor specifications Hara's team settled on reflected the fundamental compromise driving the entire design. To achieve the required 15-ton weight while incorporating the 57mm gun, adequate ammunition storage, a 4-man crew, and sufficient fuel for operational range, armor protection had to be minimized. 25mm of face-hardened steel represented the maximum thickness the design could accommodate while remaining within weight limits. The steel was manufactured using Japanese techniques that produced armor with adequate hardness characteristics, but not the superior metallurgical properties of German or American armor steel. Face hardening, a process that made the outer surface harder than the interior core, improved resistance against small-caliber projectiles. But the process had limitations against larger weapons, and the thin base thickness meant that any projectile with sufficient energy to break through the hardened face layer would penetrate the softer interior with minimal resistance. Japanese designers understood these limitations. They calculated penetration resistance against various threats. They knew that 25mm would stop rifle and machine gun fire at all ranges. They knew it would resist shell fragments and shrapnel. They knew it would provide protection against some light anti-tank weapons at longer ranges. But they also knew that dedicated anti-tank guns of 37mm or larger could defeat this armor at combat ranges. The question was whether Japanese tanks would face such weapons in sufficient numbers to matter. The answer depended on assumptions about future warfare that seemed reasonable in 1935, but would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that tank versus tank combat would be relatively rare, that most tank operations would involve supporting infantry against field, fortifications and defensive positions, that enemy anti-tank weapons would be limited in number and capability, that Japanese tactical superiority and fighting spirit would compensate for any material disadvantages. Every assumption would be tested and found wanting. The first Chi-Ha prototype completed trials in 1937. Testing revealed a mechanically reliable vehicle with good mobility and adequate firepower for its intended role. The Army Ordnance Department approved the design for production. Mitsubishi facilities in Nagoya began manufacturing Chi-Ha tanks in limited numbers, with production gradually increasing as manufacturing processes were refined and additional facilities were brought online. The tanks entered service as the Type 97 Chi-Ha, using the imperial calendar designation for the year 2597, corresponding to 1937 in the Western calendar. Initial production models reached operational units in 1938. By December 1941, when Japan initiated hostilities across the Pacific, approximately 170 Chi-Ha tanks were in service with various tank regiments. The Chi-Ha's combat debut came in China, where Japanese armor faced opponents with virtually no anti-tank capability. Chinese forces in the late 1930s possessed few artillery pieces capable of direct fire against tanks, minimal numbers of anti-tank rifles, and no dedicated anti-tank guns in meaningful quantities. Infantry armed with rifles and machine guns could not penetrate tank armor. The Chi-Ha performed exactly as designed, supporting infantry assaults, destroying fortifications, and providing mobile firepower that Chinese forces could not effectively counter. Combat reports from China validated the design choices Japanese engineers had made. The 57mm gun proved effective against field fortifications and infantry positions. The armor, thin by Western standards, was more than adequate against Chinese small arms fire. The diesel engine provided reliability and range. The suspension handled rough terrain acceptably. Tank crews gained combat experience and confidence. Commanders developed tactics for employing armor in support of infantry operations. The Chi-Ha established itself as the backbone of Japanese armored forces. This success in China created dangerous confidence. Tank crews believed their vehicles were effective combat platforms. Commanders believed their armor tactics were sound. Planners believed their assumptions about future warfare were validated. The Chi-Ha had proven itself against the opponents it faced. The question of how it would perform against enemies with modern anti-tank weapons remained theoretical, a problem to be addressed if it ever arose. For most Japanese officers involved with armor operations, it seemed unlikely that such enemies would be encountered in sufficient strength to matter. The Philippines campaign in December 1941 and January 1942 reinforced this confidence. Chi-Ha tanks supported the Japanese advance with devastating effect. American and Filipino forces, overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of Japanese operations, had limited opportunities to engage Japanese armor with anti-tank weapons. Most encounters occurred at close range in confused situations where Japanese infantry and armor worked together to overwhelm defensive positions. The tanks that American M3 Stuarts engaged at Damortis had fought at ranges of less than 200 meters in terrain that limited maneuver. Both sides had suffered casualties, but neither side had achieved a clear tactical advantage that revealed fundamental weaknesses in their respective vehicles. In Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, Chi-Ha tanks faced even weaker opposition. British forces in Malaya had deployed minimal armor and possessed limited anti-tank weapons. Dutch forces in the East Indies were similarly unprepared for armoured warfare. Japanese tanks moved through rubber plantations and across airfields with minimal resistance, their presence on the battlefield often sufficient to cause defending forces to retreat rather than attempt futile resistance. By mid-1942, Japanese tank crews had accumulated combat experience across multiple campaigns without facing sustained opposition from enemy anti-tank weapons. The Chiha seemed vindicated. The armour was adequate. The gun was effective. The mobility enabled tactical success. Tank commanders reported high confidence in their equipment. Intelligence assessments suggested that Allied forces lacked the anti-tank capability to seriously threaten Japanese armour. The assumptions underlying the Chiha's design appeared sound, but the tactical environment was changing in ways Japanese planners had not anticipated. American industrial mobilization was producing anti-tank weapons in quantities that would fundamentally alter the battlefield calculus. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun, designed in the late 1930s and entering production in 1940, was being manufactured by the thousands. The 2.36-inch M1 bazooka, developed in 1942 and rushed into production, gave individual infantry soldiers the capability to destroy tanks. The M4 Sherman medium tank, entering service in quantity by late 1942, mounted a 75mm gun that could engage Japanese armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The disparity in anti-tank capability between Japanese and American forces was growing with every month of war. Japanese infantry possessed few effective anti-tank weapons beyond magnetic mines and pole charges that required suicidal close-range attacks. Japanese tanks faced increasing numbers of weapons that could defeat their armour from safe standoff distances. American infantry had multiple organic anti-tank systems at every level from individual soldier to battalion. American tanks possessed overwhelming advantages in armour protection, firepower, and supporting systems. The turning point came not in a single dramatic battle, but through accumulating encounters, where the Chiha's vulnerabilities became impossible to ignore. On Tarawa in November 1943, Marine infantrymen destroyed Japanese tanks using 37mm anti-tank guns and bazookas. The engagements occurred at ranges of 100 to 300 meters. Marine gunners reported that their weapons penetrated Japanese tank armor easily, often completely perforating the vehicle so that projectiles exited through the opposite side. Tank crews who survived these encounters told interrogators they had been shocked by the effectiveness of American anti-tank weapons. At Kwajalein in February 1944, Army troops encountered similar results. Japanese tanks attempting to counterattack American positions were destroyed by combined arms fire involving bazookas, 37mm guns, and Sherman tanks. The Chihas proved incapable of effective resistance. Their armour could not withstand hits from any American anti-tank weapon. Their 57mm guns could not penetrate Sherman frontal armour except at extremely close range with perfect shot placement. The engagements were one-sided massacres rather than battles between armoured forces. On Saipan in June 1944, the pattern reached its culmination. Japanese defenders committed approximately 40 tanks, a mixture of Type 95 Hargos and Type 97 Chihas, in a desperate counterattack against Marine positions. The attack, launched in the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, aimed to drive American forces back to the beaches and disrupt the consolidation of the beachhead. The tanks advanced with infantry support, their commanders confident that concentrated armoured assault would overwhelm Marine defensive positions. Marine infantrymen opened fire with every weapon available. 50-caliber machine guns engaged at ranges where their armour-piercing rounds could penetrate thin Japanese armour. 37mm anti-tank guns fired armour-piercing rounds that defeated Chiha armour at any range. Bazooka teams stalked individual tanks, firing shaped charge warheads that penetrated armour regardless of impact angle. Sherman tanks, positioned in hull-down defensive positions, engaged Japanese armour with 75mm guns that could destroy Chihas from over 1,000 meters away. The Japanese counterattack collapsed within hours. More than 30 tanks were destroyed, their burning hulls littering the battlefield. Crew casualties approached 100% among destroyed vehicles. The few tanks that survived the initial assault withdrew, their crews recognizing that continued advance meant certain death. Marine infantry, initially concerned about facing concentrated armor attack, realized that Japanese tanks posed minimal threat when engaged with proper weapons. The psychological advantage Japanese armor had enjoyed through American uncertainty evaporated in the face of overwhelming evidence that Chiha tanks were death traps for their crews. Lieutenant Toshio Takahashi commanded a Chiha during the Saipan counterattack. His tank, positioned in the second wave of the assault, advanced through marine defensive positions in the pre-dawn darkness. American weapons fire seemed to come from every direction. He heard impacts on the hull armor, felt the tank shudder from hits, saw sparks inside the fighting compartment as rounds penetrated. His gunner, attempting to engage a marine position with the 57mm gun, was killed instantly when a 37mm armor-piercing round penetrated the turret and struck him in the chest. The round continued through, exiting the opposite side of the turret and leaving a hole the turret size of a man's fist. Takahashi ordered the driver to reverse, to withdraw from the killing zone. As the tank backed away, another round struck the engine compartment. The diesel engine seized immediately, heavy smoke pouring from the rear deck. The tank was immobilized. Takahashi ordered his surviving crew to abandon the vehicle. The driver and bow gunner climbed out through the forward hatches. Takahashi followed, dropping from the turret to the ground and running toward cover. Behind him, his tank burned, flames consuming the interior as ammunition cooked off in the heat. He survived the war in a prisoner-of-war camp on Guam. During interrogation sessions, American intelligence officers asked detailed questions about Japanese tank design and doctrine. Why was the armor so thin? Why were Chiha tanks committed to frontal assaults against prepared positions? Did Japanese commanders understand the capabilities of American anti-tank weapons? Takahashi answered truthfully. The armor was thin because Japanese designers prioritized other characteristics within severe weight constraints. Chiha tanks were committed to desperate attacks because Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive spirit over tactical calculation. Commanders understood intellectually that American weapons could defeat Japanese armor, but they had not internalized the degree of inferiority their equipment represented. The interrogation reports noted a common theme among captured Japanese tank crew. They expressed shock at the ease with which American weapons penetrated their armor. They described a sense of betrayal, believing they had been equipped with capable tanks only to discover their vehicles offered minimal protection. Many mentioned specific moments of realization. The first time they experienced American anti-tank fire penetrating armor they had trusted to keep them alive. These moments shattered confidence built through years of training and combat experience against weaker opponents. Production statistics revealed the scale of Japan's commitment to the Chiha despite its growing obsolescence. From 1937 through 1943, Mitsubishi facilities manufactured approximately 1,170 Chiha tanks. Additional variants, including the Shinhoto Chiha with improved turret and the Chihei with enhanced armor, added several hundred more vehicles. Total production of Chiha and its derivatives approached 1,500 tanks, making it the most numerous Japanese medium tank of the war. But production numbers told only part of the story. Loss rates told the rest. Few Chiha tanks survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by American anti-tank fire that the thin armor could not resist. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, operational Chiha tanks numbered in the dozens rather than hundreds. The vehicles that had seemed so capable in China had been revealed as obsolete death traps when facing modern opposition. The examination of the intact Chiha in Manila provided Lieutenant Colonel Weaver with comprehensive data to support tactical guidance. His technical intelligence bulletin, classified confidential and distributed throughout Pacific Command in March 1945, contained specific recommendations. Infantry units should engage Chiha tanks with organic anti-tank weapons without hesitation. 37mm guns could penetrate Chiha armor at all combat ranges. Bazookas could destroy Chiha tanks from any angle. Even 50-caliber machine guns could defeat Chiha armor at close range. Tank crews should not fear Chiha capabilities. Sherman frontal armor resisted Chiha main gunfire, except at extreme close range. Sherman's 75mm guns could destroy Chiha tanks from distances exceeding 1,000 meters. Tactical doctrine should treat Japanese medium tanks as equivalent to light tanks in terms of threat. Assessment. The bulletin's impact on American morale and tactical confidence was immediate. Infantry officers who had approached Japanese armor with appropriate caution now understood their organic weapons were effective. Tank commanders who had treated Japanese medium tanks as legitimate peer threats now recognized the overwhelming advantage American armor possessed. The psychological balance shifted decisively. American forces stopped fearing Japanese tanks and started hunting them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For Japanese tank crews across remaining Pacific battlefields, the consequences were grim. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, the few Chiha tanks defending the island were dug into prepared positions, used as stationary pillboxes rather than mobile weapons. Commanders recognized that moving tanks drew immediate fire from multiple American anti-tank systems. Survival required remaining hidden and stationary, negating every mobility advantage the Chiha design had emphasized. Even in static positions, the tanks proved vulnerable. Flamethrower tanks directed napalm into open hatches. Demolition charges placed by infantry destroyed immobilized vehicles. The armor that was supposed to protect crews became steel coffins, trapping men who had nowhere to run. On Okinawa in April and May 1945, Japanese defenders committed the 27th Tank Regiment to the island's defense. The regiment possessed a mixture of Type 95 Hagos and Type 97 Chihas, approximately 27 tanks total. American forces landed with over 800 tanks, a numerical disparity of 30-1. When Japanese armor attempted counterattacks on May 4th and 5th, the results were predictable. Most Japanese tanks were destroyed within hours, knocked out by a combination of Sherman fire, bazooka teams, and 37mm anti-tank guns. The survivors withdrew, having accomplished nothing except adding more destroyed hulls to the battlefield. The comparison with American tank protection systems highlighted the philosophical gulf between Japanese and American design approaches. The M4 Sherman featured frontal hull armor of 51mm at 56 degrees, providing effective protection equivalent to approximately 75mm against anti-tank projectiles. Turret armor reached 76mm on the mantlet. Side armor of 38mm protected against flanking fire from small-caliber weapons. The armor was manufactured using superior American steel with consistent metallurgical properties. Welded construction provided structural strength superior to riveted assembly. Internal arrangements included protected ammunition storage, fire suppression systems, and crew positions designed for sustained combat operations. The weight penalty for this protection was substantial. The M4A2 Sherman, the variant most commonly used by Marines in the Pacific, weighed 31.8 tons fully loaded, more than twice the Chiha's 15 tons. But American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. Detroit Tank Arsenal, built by Chrysler Corporation, produced M4 Shermans at rates exceeding 100 tanks per month during peak production periods. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, operated by General Motors, manufactured over 11,000 Shermans across multiple variants. American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Lima Locomotive Works, Pacific Car and Foundry, Pressed Steel Car Company, Pullman Standard, and Federal Machine and Welder all contributed to Sherman production. 10 major manufacturers, plus countless subcontractors, produced components, weapons, radios, and supporting systems. By war's end, American factories had built 49,234 Sherman tanks. Japan produced approximately 1,500 Chiha and Chihei medium tanks combined during the same period. The numerical disparity was 30-1, but the qualitative disparity was equally significant. Each Sherman offered superior protection, firepower, mobility, and supporting systems compared to Japanese medium tanks. American crews fought in vehicles designed to bring them home alive. Japanese crews fought in vehicles where survival depended on avoiding combat entirely. The examination of the Chiha in Manila had revealed the complete story. The armor measurements Weaver recorded with his micrometer were not design failures or manufacturing defects. They were deliberate choices made by engineers who believed that firepower and mobility mattered more than protection. Japanese designers had created exactly what their specifications demanded: a 15-ton medium tank with a 57mm gun and acceptable mobility. The armor protection was minimized because protection would have prevented achieving the required weight target. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1935 technology and 1935 assumptions about future warfare. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and superior technology. The Chiha became a symbol of Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical objectives. It became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. It became proof that industrial warfare between modern nations demands production capacity, technological superiority, and design philosophies that prioritize survivability alongside combat effectiveness. When Lieutenant Colonel Weaver climbed down from the Chiha that February afternoon in Manila, he carried with him measurements that would be transmitted across the Pacific within days. 25mm of frontal armor, 20mm on the sides and rear, 12mm on the roof and belly. The numbers were precise, verified, undeniable. They proved what American forces had suspected for months. Japanese medium tanks were not serious threats to properly equipped infantry. They were obsolete vehicles from an earlier era of warfare, inadequate for modern combat against peer adversaries. The crew that abandoned this particular Chiha in Manila had survived by walking away from a vehicle whose thin armor offered no protection against American weapons. Most Chiha crews were not so fortunate. They climbed into their tanks knowing the danger, crossed battlefields where every American weapon could penetrate their armor, and died in overwhelming numbers, and consumed by fires and explosions that the inadequate protection could not prevent. The Chiha's story is ultimately about the price of inadequate protection. It demonstrates that mobility and firepower alone cannot guarantee success when purchased at the cost of crew survivability. The 57mm gun meant nothing when the tank carrying it could be destroyed by infantry weapons. The 40km/h top speed provided no advantage when American bazookas could engage from ambush positions. The careful weight optimization that kept the tank at 15 tons became irrelevant when that weight savings came directly from armor that should have protected the crew. The final missions flown by Chiha tanks in combat came during the defense of the Japanese home islands in August 1945. Approximately 200 Chiha and Chihei tanks remained operational, held in reserve for the anticipated American invasion that never came. These vehicles, carefully preserved and hidden in prepared positions across Kyushu and Honshu, represented the last armored reserves Japan possessed. Their crews had been briefed on American capabilities, understood the limitations of their equipment, and accepted that their tanks offered minimal protection against weapons American infantry carried as standard issue. They waited in their positions for an invasion that would be preempted by atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, those Chiha crews climbed out of their tanks, knowing they would never face the combat that had destroyed so many of their comrades across the Pacific. The relief was profound and complicated. They had survived, but only because they never had to test their inadequate armor against American firepower. The tanks they had maintained and prepared represented a final defensive gambit that everyone involved understood was built on desperation rather than reasonable hope of success. After the war ended, American occupation forces conducted comprehensive surveys of Japanese military equipment. Teams of engineers and intelligence specialists examined every major weapons system, documenting capabilities and limitations for post-war analysis. Chiha tanks found across the home islands were measured, photographed, and tested. The examinations confirmed what battlefield experience had already demonstrated. The armor was inadequate by any modern standard. The gun, while respectable for a medium tank of the mid-1930s, was obsolete by 1945 standards. The mechanical systems were reliable but crude. The internal arrangements were cramped and inefficient. Every aspect of the design reflected the constraints Japan had faced and the compromises Japanese engineers had accepted. American engineers produced detailed technical reports comparing Japanese and American tank design philosophies. The reports noted that Japanese designers had consistently prioritized weight reduction over protection, accepting thin armor as the price for achieving mobility and firepower within strict weight limits. American designers had made opposite choices, accepting weight penalties to provide crew protection that dramatically improved survival rates. The philosophical difference was stark and measurable. American tank crews had survival rates approaching 70%, even when their vehicles were hit and disabled. Japanese tank crews rarely survived vehicle destruction. The armor that was supposed to protect them instead became a steel trap from which escape was nearly impossible once American anti-tank weapons engaged. The casualty statistics among Chiha crews remain difficult to verify with precision from available records. Japanese military documentation was incomplete and often destroyed during the war's final months. But approximate figures compiled by post-war researchers suggest that crew casualties exceeded 80% across all Chiha tanks committed to combat. Of approximately 1,500 Chiha and derivative tanks produced, fewer than 300 survived to war's end. The remainder were destroyed in combat, with their crews killed or severely wounded in the overwhelming majority of cases. The survivors, Japanese tank crewmen who lived through encounters with American forces, carried memories of specific moments when their confidence in their equipment shattered. For some, it was the first time they experienced American anti-tank fire-penetrating armor they had trusted. For others, it was watching nearby tanks explode from hits that should not have been fatal. For many, it was the gradual accumulation of evidence that their tanks were obsolete, that no amount of training or courage could compensate for fundamental material inferiority. These men returned to Japan after the war, carrying knowledge that their nation had sent them to fight with equipment that could not protect them, that the armor specifications, measured in millimeters, had been insufficient from the moment American forces deployed modern anti-tank weapons in quantity. Former tank commander Hiroshi Yamamoto, who fought on Saipan and survived by abandoning his disabled Chiha before it was destroyed, offered perhaps the most direct assessment in interviews conducted decades after the war. We climbed into our tanks, believing they would protect us. We were told our armor was adequate, that our fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The first time I saw a 37mm round punch through our turret like it was paper, I knew we had been deceived. Not by our immediate commanders, who believed what they told us, but by the system that produced tanks with armor measured in millimeters when our enemies had weapons measured in effectiveness against centimeters of steel. Every tanker who survived knew the truth. Our tanks were death traps. We fought in them because we had no choice, but we knew. The technical intelligence bulletins Lieutenant Colonel Weaver produced based on the Manila examination circulated throughout American forces well into 1946, used as training materials for occupation troops and as reference documents for analysts studying Japanese military capabilities. The measurements he recorded that February afternoon became standard references cited in official histories and technical analyses. 25mm frontal armor, 20mm side armor, 12mm roof and belly. The numbers were precise, documented, and damning. They proved that Japanese medium tanks offered protection barely superior to light tanks, inadequate against any American anti-tank weapon from bazookas to 37mm guns to 75mm tank cannons. The Chiha tanks that survived the war were shipped to the United States for detailed examination at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where American ordnance specialists conducted exhaustive testing. They fired American weapons at the armor from various ranges and angles, documenting penetration characteristics with scientific precision. The tests confirmed battlefield reports. 37mm armor-piercing rounds penetrated Chiha frontal armor at ranges exceeding 800 meters. Bazooka rockets penetrated from any angle at combat ranges. 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds penetrated side armor at ranges under 400 meters. Even 30 caliber armor-piercing ammunition, fired from standard infantry rifles, could penetrate the 12mm roof armor under favorable conditions. The test reports noted that Chiha armor showed adequate face hardening and reasonable metallurgical properties within the limitations of Japanese steel production. The problem was not armor quality. The problem was armor thickness. 25mm of face-hardened steel, regardless of quality, simply could not resist projectiles designed to defeat 30 to 40mm of armor. The mathematics of penetration mechanics were unforgiving. Energy, velocity, projectile design, and armor thickness determined outcomes. The Chiha's armor thickness placed it in a category where weapons designed for light vehicles could achieve penetration. No amount of crew skill or tactical employment could change that fundamental reality. The post-war technical reports concluded that Japanese tank design philosophy reflected severe industrial constraints rather than poor engineering judgment. Japanese designers understood armor protection principles. They knew that thicker armor improved survivability. They calculated penetration resistance against various threats, but they also operated within weight limits that forced impossible choices. Increase armor thickness and the tank becomes too heavy, requiring a larger engine which adds more weight, demanding stronger suspension which adds more weight, in a spiral that quickly exceeds manufacturing capabilities and operational requirements. Japanese industry could not produce 30-ton medium tanks in meaningful numbers. The choice was between 15-ton tanks with inadequate armor or no medium tanks at all. Engineers chose the former, accepting known vulnerabilities as the price of fielding armor in quantities sufficient for operational deployment. American engineers, reading these reports, recognized the fundamental advantage American industrial capacity provided. United States Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Republic Steel, and other companies produced armor plate in quantities that permitted building 30-ton medium tanks by the tens of thousands. The Detroit tank arsenal alone consumed millions of pounds of armor steel monthly during peak production. The industrial capacity to manufacture, transport, and support heavy tanks existed at scales Japanese planners could not match. American soldiers fought in vehicles weighing twice what Japanese tanks weighed, with armor 3 times as thick, supported by logistics systems that kept them operational, because American industry could produce and sustain such vehicles in the quantities modern warfare demanded. The Chiha's legacy extended beyond World War II into post-war analyses of armored warfare doctrine. Military theorists studying the Pacific War identified the Chiha as a primary example of how industrial constraints shape tactical capabilities. Nations with limited industrial capacity face choices between quantity and quality, between producing many inadequate vehicles or few adequate ones. Japan chose quantity, fielding approximately 1,500 Chiha tanks rather than producing smaller numbers of better protected vehicles. The choice made sense within Japanese strategic planning, which emphasized offensive operations where mobility and firepower mattered more than protection. But the strategy collapsed when facing an opponent who possessed both quantitative and qualitative superiority, who could field more tanks that were individually superior to Japanese vehicles. The lessons learned from Kai-Ha, combat performance influenced post-war tank design worldwide. The importance of adequate armor protection became axiomatic in tank design philosophy. No major nation would again produce medium tanks with armor thickness measured in millimeters rather than centimeters. The minimum acceptable protection level for medium tanks increased dramatically, with 50 millimeters becoming the absolute minimum and most designs incorporating 75 to 100 millimeters of frontal armor as standard. The crew survivability calculations that Japanese designers had subordinated to weight considerations became primary design factors. Tanks existed to accomplish missions, but accomplishing missions required bringing trained crews home alive to fight again. Equipment that killed its own crews through inadequate protection was wasteful, regardless of its other capabilities. For Marines and soldiers who fought across Pacific Islands from Tarawa to Okinawa, the Chiha became a reference point for understanding Japanese material inferiority. When they encountered Japanese equipment in other categories, weapons, aircraft, artillery, small arms, they measured it against the Chiha standard. Was this equipment adequate for modern warfare or obsolete like Japanese tanks? The answer was often discouraging for Japanese forces. Much of Japan's military equipment reflected the same constraints that produced the Chiha, the same forced choices between performance characteristics, the same acceptance of inadequacy as the price of achieving production numbers within limited industrial capacity. The story of the Type 97 Chiha is not simply a story of inadequate armor plating measured in millimeters. It is a story about what happens when industrial capacity cannot support military ambitions, when design philosophy accepts crew casualties as inevitable, rather than problems to be solved through engineering, when assumptions about future warfare prove wrong but cannot be corrected because industrial base limitations prevent producing better alternatives. Japanese engineers who designed the Chiha were not incompetent. They were trapped by constraints that permitted no good choices, only choices between different types of inadequacy. The measurements Lieutenant Colonel Weaver recorded in Manila that February afternoon told that story in numbers precise and undeniable. 25 millimeters frontal armor, adequate against small arms fire, inadequate against any dedicated anti-tank weapon. 20 millimeters side armor, vulnerable to weapons American infantry carried as standard equipment. 12 millimeters roof armor, penetrable by 50 caliber machine gun fire under favorable conditions. The Chiha had been designed to fight enemies without modern anti-tank weapons. It faced enemies whose infantry carried weapons that could destroy it from ambush positions. The outcome was predetermined by specifications set in 1935 and industrial, and constraints that prevented meaningful improvements. The thousands of Japanese tank crewmen who climbed into Chiha tanks across Pacific battlefields did so knowing their equipment was inferior, but having no alternative. They fought with what they were given because military discipline and cultural values demanded they accept their assignments regardless of consequences. Most died in their tanks, consumed by fires that inadequate armor could not prevent, killed by weapons their protection could not resist. Their deaths were not random misfortunes of war. They were predictable consequences of armor specifications that offered insufficient protection against weapons designed to defeat such armor. The Chiha stands as physical evidence of the price nations pay when military requirements exceed industrial capabilities, when design compromises prioritize some characteristics while accepting catastrophic vulnerabilities in others, when assumptions about future warfare prove wrong but cannot be corrected because the industrial and technological base cannot produce better alternatives. Every measurement, every specification, every combat report confirms the same conclusion. The Type 97 Chiha was not a failed design. It was a successful design for requirements that should never have been accepted, built by an industrial base that could not support modern armored warfare, committed to combat against opponents it could not defeat. American forces learned this through examination and combat experience. They measured the armor, tested its resistance, documented its failures, and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Japanese forces learned it through catastrophic losses that could not be sustained or replaced. They fought in tanks whose armor offered no protection, watched their comrades die in vehicles that became burning coffins, and survived only when they abandoned their tanks before American weapons found them. The knowledge that their equipment was inadequate, that their armor measured in millimeters when it should have been measured in centimeters, that every mission might be their last because their protection was insufficient, shaped every action they took in combat. The intact Chiha in Manila, abandoned by its crew during the American advance, survived because the men who operated it recognized that remaining with the tank meant certain death. They walked away from 15 tons of steel that was supposed to protect them, understanding that the thin armor had become a liability rather than an asset. Lieutenant Colonel Weaver's examination revealed exactly why they made that choice. The measurements he recorded proved what Japanese tank crews had learned through bitter experience. 25 millimeters of armor was not enough. It had never been enough. And no amount of fighting spirit or tactical skill could change that fundamental reality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.